Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2026 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Christophe Courchaine, Faculty Director of the Environmental Law Center and Associate Dean for Environmental and Experiential Programs here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Each talk in our series this summer is worth one Vermont CLE credit, so please keep track of which talks you attend for your records. We will have time for some Q&A after today's presentation. And for those of you who are watching live on VLGS YouTube, you can enter your questions on the right-hand chat space anytime, and we will get through as many as we can during the Q&A section. If you run into trouble entering your questions in the chat for whatever reason, feel free to email them to me or with my difficult name, Courtney Collins may be easier to email. ccollins@vermontlaw.edu, and we will make sure to get your questions into the discussion. So I am very pleased to welcome to Hot Topics Kamaile Turčan. Kamaile joined the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii at Manoa in 2023 as an associate professor of law, where she teaches civil procedure and administrative law, among other courses, in support of the environmental law program curriculum. She's an alumna of Richardson, where she served as co-editor-in-chief of the University of Hawaii Law Review and earned an environmental law certificate. Prior to joining the faculty at Richardson, Professor Turčan was a partner at Jones Day in Washington, D.C., where she maintained an appellate advocacy and complex civil litigation practice. She was an attorney advisor in the Office of General Counsel at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where she provided legal advice to agency clients on the application of federal law to the management of fishery resources and protected species within the Western and Central Pacific region. At the state level, she was the second Marine Law Fellow hired under the Environmental Law Program's Fellowship Program to the Department of Land and Natural Resources, Division of Aquatic Resources. She previously clerked for the Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor of the Supreme Court of the United States, Judge Richard Clifton of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and Judge David Ezra of the U.S. District Court for the District of Hawaii. Professor Turčan's scholarly research interests fall at the intersection of administrative law, environmental law, land use policy, federalism, and the courts, with a focus on fundamental questions of governance and decision-making. Her scholarship has appeared in numerous journals and law reviews. She joins us this summer at VLGS as our inaugural Distinguished Aquaculture Law Summer Scholar, and we are absolutely delighted to have her on campus. Today, she'll present challenges and opportunities in sustainable marine aquaculture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kamaile Turčan.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It is absolutely my pleasure to be here. Before I get started, I do want to recognize and really applaud VLGS for hosting this summer series and also building up an aquaculture program. Aquaculture, as I'll be talking about today, is the fastest growing food industry in the world. And so because of that, sustainability questions really deserve the attention of burgeoning young lawyers, current lawyers, and policymakers. So my talk today is framed around two related questions that are really the focus of my research on this topic. The first, how do we envision what sustainability in aquaculture actually means? Second, the intersection of sustainability and various legal regulatory regimes. So humans have practiced aquaculture in one form or another for millennia. What is new is the industrial scale at which aquaculture is practiced today. And so I'm going to be discussing today the legal, ecological, and ethical dimensions to this substantial industry. But first, I'm going to go ahead and start with the basics. So what actually is aquaculture? Aquaculture, defined broadly, is the raising and harvesting of aquatic organisms confined into some sort of a cage or structure and grown out to a desired size before being harvested like a crop, essentially, for food or other commercial use. Aquaculture can take many forms. So it might be fish, mussels, oysters, seaweed, shrimp, etc. And the aquaculture facilities are found on land, they're found in inland streams and the ocean. So what this means is that the legal issues and the environmental issues, the ethical issues, they are all incredibly diverse and regional. And so if there's one thing that I hope you all take away from my talk today, I hope it's that aquaculture means different things in different places, and that's going to mean different environmental impacts. Now, depending on where the cage is located, there might be federal regulations, there might be state regulations, there might be cultural and political issues that manifest in one way for one type of aquaculture, but not for another. So the controversies that exist around salmon that is farmed in marine net pens off the coast of the United States, Norway or Chile, for example, that is not the same as the controversies that may or may not exist for farmed catfish out of the Mississippi River, for oysters that are farmed in coastal estuaries around the Gulf of Mexico. There's land-based microalgae ponds that are sited in Hawaii, and there's shrimp farms right near mangrove forest in Thailand. Those are all very different environments, species, and potential issues. Before I go too far along, I do want to commend to you the Hot Topics lecture by Martha Mendoza a few weeks ago, and I believe still available online. Martha spoke on the issue of worker exploitation in aquaculture supply chains, in particular the shrimp farming industry. Now, my own particular focus is marine finfish aquaculture, and while I will endeavor to make points that are broadly applicable, I do hope you take away that there will be unique issues for each type of species and each location, right? Especially when we are talking about food imported from other countries, which was a focus as well of her presentation. And frankly, that's going to be true both for farm-raised food and also wild-caught food, which I will be bringing into the sort of holistic conversation today. I promise I won't hit you with too many statistics, but there are some high-level big ones that are useful to have. Here in the United States, Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, Alabama, and the state of Washington are the leading states in aquaculture. And of that, catfish and oysters are actually the leading sectors in the United States. That's from a 2023 USDA report. And actually, shrimp is the seafood that Americans consume the most, but most of that actually comes from abroad. Globally, the most commonly raised food across the world are carp, tilapia, salmon, shrimp, and oysters. And that's data from the UN FAO. So because of this variety, it can be difficult to generalize aquaculture's environmental footprint, but we can draw some broad conclusions, which I'll give sort of an overview before getting into some of the details I want to talk about today. So first, sort of generally accepted understanding is that seafood farming is considered one of the more sustainable types of aquaculture because these species, they require no inputs to grow. You don't need to really feed seaweed. And on balance, they tend to improve their surrounding water quality and associated habitats. Two, of animal farming, farming for filter feeding bivalves, such as mussels, clams, and oysters, is considered more sustainable than is shrimp or finfish farming. Because like seaweeds, bivalves do not require feed inputs, and by their nature, they do tend to clean and improve their surrounding environment. Three, for finfish farming, which is what I'll be talking about today primarily, it turns out that the specific species cultivated and the location of the aquaculture pen significantly affects the type and extent of environmental impact. And so we'll be talking more about this. Bottom line, this is a $300 billion with a B, dollar industry that is also the fastest growing food producing market in the world. So I just want to pause on that. It still is not yet the largest market, but it is the fastest growing food producing market. And again, that's from the UN FAO report. I've borrowed this beautiful chart from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and what it demonstrates here is that aquaculture production of animals, meaning the type that we tend to eat, surpassed wild-caught fisheries for the first time on record at 51% of the global supply, and that's from the 2024 UN report. So this is a big deal. It is now statistically more likely that your seafood was aquaculture raised rather than wild caught. And frankly, this is likely only to increase. Wild fish catch, as you can see from this chart, has basically plateaued. Meanwhile, the demand for fish has increased. Here's another lovely little graphic. It shows that here in the United States, one, most seafood actually comes from another country. And two, most of that seafood is farmed food. So bottom line is this is a fast-growing industry. It involves a lot of money. And even if you do not eat seafood, this is a huge part of how society has structured its food supply system, and it warrants some consideration. Okay, so turning to my research, I explored the question of sustainability through one particular type of aquaculture, the marine finfish aquaculture. A couple of the pens are pictured here for you if you're not familiar with it and haven't seen what it might look like. So I focus on this version of aquaculture because it is a growing industry in Hawaii, where I am currently doing my research. And I also think, in addition to that, it offers sort of a helpful way to think through the challenges and opportunities related to aquaculture and the food supply sort of writ large, not only on aquaculture itself. Marine finfish aquaculture, it can take place in near-shore coastal waters, and it can also take place miles offshore in federal waters. As depicted here, the fish are usually confined in mesh cages that are submerged underwater and either tethered to the ocean floor or motorized to maintain a fixed location. You should think sort of large, room-sized pens where the fish are stocked, raised, and then harvested. This is definitely not theoretical. One company has been growing Kona kampachi in the state of Hawaii, in state waters for years, and they actually sell their almapo jack at restaurants across the state. Maine currently does it with salmon. Norway does it as well. I'm aware of one company that currently has plans to develop aquaculture pens off the waters of New York and Florida, which, if successful, could potentially cover hundreds of acres of ocean in both locations. So how are we to think about this? This is essentially, in my view, a societal choice about where to allocate risks and how to mitigate harms within our food infrastructure. There's not really going to be a free choice here. There's sort of no utopia in terms of environmental impact, but I think that there probably are better choices than others. Of course, not everyone agrees all the time about which is the better choice. But my goal for today is to present some of the things that we should be thinking through. All right, here is a diagram that is framing my sort of fundamental challenge to you, which is to consider at what scale are we evaluating the sustainability of aquaculture, right? I argue that it is not just the pens themselves, but our supply of fish holistically that we need to be looking at, which means taking a hard look at the trade-offs between industrial scale aquaculture and the industrial scale wild fishery. Okay, so the reality is that most folks who eat fish are not catching fish themselves. Some do. I love my friends who catch tuna off the side of their canoe and share it with me. I really appreciate that. But that's not how most seafood is obtained. And the global demand for fish is only increasing, right? All of our doctors are telling us to eat some healthy fish and get those omega-3s. And so the reality is the fish will come either from farm-raised or wild-caught populations, both of which are taking place at an industrial scale. And I hope one thing that you take away from this is that if we were to evaluate the harms from aquaculture in isolation, that does tend to create a sort of false dichotomy, right? This kind of fictional choice between what might be an environmentally harmful aquaculture industry sort of with an idealized wild-caught fishery. So I think we need to sort of grapple with the reality of both. There are going to be sustainability trade-offs between industrial scale aquaculture and industrial scale wild fisheries. So on this particular slide that I have here for you, the image on the left, the top left, it's from NOAA Fisheries. And it's a little bit of a sterilized depiction of what industrial scale wild catch might look like. And I'm contrasting it to what an industrial scale aquaculture pen would look like there on the right. The top left is a long line, which if you're not familiar with this type of fishing, it's literally a very long line, a mile or often more, that's dropped behind a fishing vessel, and there are hooks dropped down at various depths in order to catch, tuna and swordfish and such. The bottom left is a depiction of what is called a purse seine net, which essentially is dropped directly into the water and circles like a purse, whatever school of fish they're trying to catch. Now, in reality, there are in the open ocean birds and turtles and sharks and mammals that are also attracted to the bait on the hooks. And the purse seine net will scoop up dolphins and other animals right along with the fish. So my focus in my writing is to offer up a way to think through these decisions about our food supply. So first, I'm going to talk about the opportunities, right? What could aquaculture potentially offer? I'm going to focus on 5. The first is food security. So aquaculture is one way to ensure sort of a steady, regionalized food supply chain. Especially after supply chain challenges during COVID in Hawaii and elsewhere, we are increasingly aware of our reliance on shipping in food from afar. And aquaculture done at scale is potentially one way to address this. Related to this number one opportunity is overfishing. So farmed fish can remove the strain on depleted wild fish stocks. It is well known that many wild fish stocks, their numbers have absolutely plummeted, and it's really just getting worse. According to NOAA, nearly 50 species in the Pacific and Atlantic are already overfished, which is a term that refers to the idea that the fish species cannot sustain a healthy population size any longer if they're continued to be fished. And this includes some species of salmon and rockfish and tuna and swordfish, and the list sort of goes on and on. Now, eating farmed fish is an opportunity to allow these wild fish stocks to recover. The third opportunity in aquaculture relates to what's called IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated. So IUU fishing is a global problem that threatens ocean ecosystems. Why is that? Well, it's because fishing offshore, and this often can be hundreds of miles offshore, it's very hard to regulate. There is detrimental fishing happening in marine protected areas. Sometimes they fish protected species, and sometimes vessels are catching more of a certain stock than they are supposed to, et cetera, et cetera. There are rules and guidelines about how to fish on the high seas and in territorial waters, but the reality is that it's pretty hard to monitor. It is easier to get a handle on what's going on in the aquaculture pens, which are more visible and trackable and don't tend to move around quite so much. The fourth opportunity is to reduce bycatch. Now, bycatch is, to my mind, one of the more compelling reasons to at least consider moving away from wild catch towards aquaculture. I don't want to get too grim for this presentation, but basically, bycatch is when something other than the intended targeted species of fish is caught. I'm going to flip quickly back to this slides that I show you. These 2 examples of purse seine and longline, they're just examples of many different types of fishing that goes on in wild catch fishery. The reality is that by virtue of how they operate, they necessarily do kill other animals. Sharks and dolphins are attracted to the same food as our tuna. Absolutely, it's regulated in the United States in particular. There are rules about bycatch, but bycatch is also unavoidable just by the nature of these fishing styles. And vessels are allowed to, there are provided a certain quota of bycatch under law. So flipping back here, if you look to the bottom right, there's a little picture. I selected this photo on the bottom right because it's a more hopeful one. This particular photo depicts divers who responded to help release some whale sharks that had been caught up in a pursing net, because the whale sharks, they eat sardines and anchovies, the types of little fish that are being caught in these pursing nets. So the whale sharks get caught too, and this particular story has a happy ending. But of course, they often don't. What I have here, I'm going to play a short video. It's a video put together by NOAA Fisheries, and it's showing how fishermen use advances in technology to try to minimize their bycatch, right? The fishermen in the wild caught fishery, they don't want bycatch either. And so there's been advancements to reduce it. But it is still something that happens. So this video is just 2 minutes long. There are some images of animals in some distress. And so if you prefer not to watch the video, you can come back in 2 minutes, but it's mostly informative.
U.S. fisheries are among the largest and most sustainable fisheries in the world. But when you're fishing in the ocean, it's impossible to catch only those animals you want. Sometimes you bring up other critters like jellyfish or sea stars, or species of fish that are unwanted or can't be sold. Other times, these animals are illegal to keep, like protected dolphins, turtles, out-of-season fish, or even seabirds. Collectively, this is known as bycatch. The amount of bycatch varies widely by fishery and type of fishing gear. Where it's a problem, it creates waste in commercial and recreational fisheries, which makes some fisheries less sustainable and can affect jobs. It can also have unintended consequences, like impeding the recovery of protected species that get caught or entangled in fishing gear. The bottom line is that we need to tackle bycatch, and NOAA Fisheries and our partners are working on innovative ways to avoid it, such as developing and promoting gear designs that exclude non-targeted species, monitoring bycatch hotspots to help fishermen steer clear, and educating anglers on how to safely release their unwanted catch. Together, we're working to get bycatch back into the sea where it belongs. It's why the U.S. is a global leader in sustainability, and U.S. caught seafood is a smart choice. Find out more about how we're addressing bycatch at fisheries.noaa.gov.
Okay, great. So I do think it's worth emphasizing that NOAA and other wild catch fisheries are making great efforts to reduce bycatch. The reality remains, however, that it'll never be zero. And currently, worldwide, I don't think it's an exaggeration to describe the amount of bycatch as essentially catastrophic. Okay, dolphins, whales, sea turtles, birds, they get hooked on the same gear that's used to catch the fish. The U.S. Marine Mammal Commission estimates that over 650,000 individual mammals are killed each year by the international fishing fleet, not just in the United States, internationally. And shark bycatch is even higher. That's actually in the multiple millions per year. So prioritizing aquaculture over wild catch could significantly reduce these numbers simply by virtue of how aquaculture is actually accomplished. And oops, sorry about that. I gotta get back. Last but not least, one more opportunity in terms of aquaculture is looking at human rights considerations. So human rights is a heavy topic that is difficult to confront sometimes and talk about, but human rights must be included in the environmental sustainability conversation. Human trafficking and forced labor, unfortunately, are absolutely known to occur in the wild caught fishing industry on the high seas. Some have described it essentially as modern day slavery, because what happens is there's a form of debt bondage that occurs where people are unable to pay off debts and they're kept on the vessels for months or years at a time to, pay off debt and kind of catch an essentially impossible number of fish. This is a phenomenon that the UN has been tracking. And so my point in bringing this up is, as we address sustainability concerns in aquaculture, I do think it's important to keep in context that there are true harms accompanying reliance on wild fish stocks that I think sometimes is underconsidered in the conversation about aquaculture. There is a cost if we keep the status quo. All that being said, of course, aquaculture itself is not perfect. One of the main considerations with aquaculture is, look, are we simply replicating all of the problems of concentrated feeding operations on land, but now we're just importing them into the water? I want to start by showing just 2 minutes of this short video. Basically, it gives a brief overview of what aquaculture actually looks like. So I imagine that some folks watching this don't actually have a good sense of what it entails. So I'll let it go for about 2 minutes, and then we'll get into it.
Demand for seafood is increasing around the world, and the United States is no exception. Providing enough fish for a growing seafood demand requires a little innovation. Here at True North Aquaculture, indoor water tanks are where it all begins. A fish like this can hold up to 5,000 eggs.
Oh yeah, look at the size of them eggs. Yeah, see? Oh yeah. Good eggs.
To make sure that juvenile salmon thrive, the water in the tanks is carefully monitored to try to mimic the rivers the fish would normally hatch in.
If we don't have clean water, we can't grow our product. Our salmon require the cleanest waters that are available. So we're monitoring dissolved oxygens, temperatures, pH. We very strictly monitor how much feed goes into each tank.
As the little fish grow into larger fish, they're moved to different tanks to give fish more room to swim and grow. And eventually, just like wild salmon, they're ready to go to the ocean. There are almost 700,000 fish in these floating pens.
Healthy, happy fish.
The netting, like a fence on a traditional farm, keeps the fish in and predators like this seal out. To be sustainable, fish farmers need to deal with the food going in and waste coming out. One way is to improve the feed.
The feed we use has come a long ways in 20 years or so. It used to be primarily made out of wild fish. Today, we're using only 15 to 20% fish in our pellets. So we're much more sustainable today than we were 20 years ago.
Along with more.
Okay, well, the video actually continues on a little bit, but so you're welcome to look at it. It's linked on the slides that I believe will be made available. I mostly wanted to show you for those of you who haven't seen it, to get a sense of what it kind of looks like when we say that the fish are grown up in offshore pens. Okay, but let's talk about the challenges related to sustainability in aquaculture. So the first, as I mentioned, is like animal cruelty concerns with pig and cattle farms, there is concern for the welfare of the fish when they are in the pen. Now, the extent of concerns for this varies considerably by species, and so it is a bit difficult to generalize. For example, this isn't really a concern, for example, for seaweed and mollusks, but when we're talking fish, the smaller herbivorous fish, who by nature tend to stay close to nearshore reefs, are maybe less aggressive and they naturally school. They may not be similarly impacted by the net pen environment as might other larger carnivorous fish who are maybe more aggressive and also migratory by nature, such as salmon and tuna. So looking at this first fish welfare question, again, it's going to be a very species-specific conversation. The second common concern about aquaculture is water pollution and habitat impacts. So again, this is going to be a high density of fish in pens, and what that means is there may be fish feed, feces, and other debris that'll either be trapped in the tank itself or flushed out into the surrounding water and could potentially, hit and impact the ocean floor. So for this one, we're talking essentially ecosystem impact. Again, these negative impacts are going to be species and location specific. There tends to be more buildup, for example, if the pen is in nearshore waters, less buildup if the pen is offshore with deeper waters and potentially more flushing due to currents. Again, the type of fish you choose matters. If you choose fish that eat seaweed, for example, that won't produce the same concerns as might fish that require other inputs. Related to that is number 3, which is the source of the fish feed. So you saw in the video, they were talking about the pellets that they were feeding these particular salmon. Different aquaculture strategies use different types of food. But, you know, one of the supposed benefits of aquaculture is that we are leaving wild ecosystems alone, then it doesn't really make much sense if we feed the fish wild caught fish, which is certainly how some of these are happening now. But there is, however, experiments being done now with feeding farmed fish, feeding them bugs as opposed to other fish, which is also a natural source of food for fish oftentimes. Also, if you move towards herbivorous fish, that solves a lot of these problems because they just eat seaweed and other detritus. Basically, if you focus on fish that's lower in the trophic system of the ecosystem, the more you might be able to avoid some of these problems related to buildup. 4 is genetic pollution. And what I mean by that is there is concern about what happens when the farmed fish escape their pen and mingle with wild populations. There have been some very high-profile escapes in Norway and the state of Washington in the past. So can the industry improve their pens and the locations that they use them to reduce the chance of gear failure and reduce the chance of this escape? It's sort of an open question about how much of the mingling is statistically significant, but it's definitely an ongoing question. The last one I'll touch on is what I refer to as extractive commercialism. And what do I mean by that? This is more of a social rather than ecological concern, but humans are indeed part of the ecology. And one common concern is that these industrial scale aquaculture facilities are just going to essentially be a big company, sets up shop, grows some fish, and then sells it somewhere else, right? So is there a way to ensure that some of this productivity goes to feeding the surrounding community to keep it within the ecosystem, essentially? And so some of the questions I have about this are, are there permit requirements or regulations that government can impose that would require, for example, a certain percentage of fish grown to be sold in the local food markets, your local grocery store, etc. And related to extractive commercialism also is the worker exploitation. I mentioned that in the wild caught fishery, there is a serious human trafficking concern. There also can be worker exploitation concerns with aquaculture facilities, especially in other countries. Shrimp farming, for example, is what Martha Mendoza's presentation was focusing on. And this is largely driven by the fact that this is a large commercial international food chain. Okay, so that was a lot. We sort of blazed through the opportunities and challenges from an ecological standpoint. I'm hoping you have sort of a high-level grasp of the range of considerations. There are others. But so is there any solution to this? Is there any way to gain the benefits of moving away from wild catch and, avoid the bycatch, protect people? But can we do that while also avoiding some of the problems of aquaculture? I will say that I am still thinking through this, but I am tentatively optimistic. And so I want to conclude this first part of the talk with some potential inspiration for strategies. As I stated at the top of the talk, aquaculture has been around a long time. We might not have to reinvent everything. In Hawaii specifically, a form of aquaculture in the form of nearshore fish ponds has been in practice for 1,000 years. Native Hawaiians have cultivated fish and other resources in these large man-made nearshore marine fish ponds as part of an ecosystem-based system of land use management. And so back in the day, the fish ponds provided supplemental nutrients to a population in the hundreds of thousands prior to contact with the Western world. And the fish ponds are still around today, although not in as great a number. And many of us are working to revitalize them. Now, I want to be clear that these fish ponds are distinct from net pen aquaculture in some important ways. But I still think that there are strategies that might be able to be adopted from the Hawaiian fish pond approach and applied to the net pen design. And so what might these be? If we were to follow some of the kind of long-standing strategies in the fish pond approach, the first one might be grow species native to the area. That sort of seems like an ecological no-brainer. Prioritize, when possible, herbivorous, non-migratory fish. Chub, mullet, they eat seaweed and algae. It's just a little bit easier to deal with, lower impact on the ecosystem. Does that mean that the consumer market might have to adapt a little? Yeah, right? Does that mean that perhaps salmon is the wrong way to go? Perhaps, and that might not be a popular opinion. But essentially, the fish ponds here are a form of eco-mimicry, right? There's not a monoculture of fish. There will be plants and algae and maybe some shrimp. There might even be some predators. So for example, if in the fish pond, the fish are too numerous or some are getting sickly, they might actually introduce a predator like an eel or a barracuda instead of chemicals, kind of balance out the population a bit. So that's the kind of Hawaiian inspiration, but there are others. One example done elsewhere in terms of research is called the Integrated Multi-Trophic Aquaculture System, where basically, if you're going to have a big cage full of fish, why don't you also put a bunch of algae and oysters or kelp in the pens? And here's a drawing that depicts the idea, and here's an example of an experiment from the University of New Hampshire, where they had trout, mussels, and kelp. Fundamentally, the idea is, can we do farming based on ecosystem relationships, which frankly is something that environmentalists have been advocating for terrestrial farming for a long time as well. And so for me, the bottom line is that as the industry moves forward, we need to regulate it, which depending on location might mean taking some species off the table. And two, look to more ecological based strategies. Now, because I am a lawyer, for this last part, I'm going to wrap up with law stuff. I do wonder where the law comes into all of this. So I'll finish with some points about the regulatory landscape, and I'll say two words: diversity and uncertainty. From the legal perspective, the first word, diversity, here applies to state laws in the United States. There are a lot of states, and a lot of states are doing different things, both on land and on water. The second word, uncertainty, that applies to federal law. As you might imagine, aquaculture right now encapsulates much of the federal regulatory upheaval of the current moment. There are changes coming both from the Trump administration and the Supreme Court that are leaving what, in my view, are worrisome gaps in our regulatory ability. And I'll start quickly with the federal. So the challenge here is that there is regulatory uncertainty about which federal agency actually has authority and how much authority to actually regulate aquaculture as an industry. My primary concern is I want to make sure that it is not just the Wild West out there in federal waters. Now, in 2020, President Trump issued an executive order that called for the expansion of seafood production. Then in 2025, President Trump followed that up with another executive order that called for the restoring of American seafood competitiveness, also calling for the end to overregulation. What does that mean? I don't totally know, but that's something we're working through now. What we do know is that President Trump designated NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as the lead agency for aquaculture projects. In turn, NOAA has released a strategic plan to expand a resilient aquaculture industry and is actually already identifying what they call aquaculture opportunity areas for commercial aquaculture in federal waters in the Gulf of Mexico and off of Southern California, but also working in conjunction with Alaska in some state waters. Although I'll say that one's only seaweed and shellfish, because Alaska actually prohibits finfish in state law, which we'll get to in a second. Bottom line, this is definitely happening. There's sort of a full speed ahead mentality, I think, from the industry side of things. And so from the law side of things, how are we going to make sure this is done in a thoughtful way? And I said I was concerned about aquaculture in federal waters being the Wild West. Why am I worried about that? Well, it's because some agencies like the EPA and the Army Corps, for example, they do issue permits, but they tend to be for discrete issues such as, water discharge, navigation, etc. Those agencies aren't necessarily, ready or specialized to do a sort of ecosystem level analysis that NOAA might do for a new commercial industry. And why can't NOAA regulate aquaculture? Well, there is actually a circuit split to some extent, pre-Loper-Bright, on whether NOAA is authorized to regulate fishing, aquaculture as fishing under its statutory authority. Now, as it turns out, NOAA's primary enabling statute is the Magnuson-Stevens Act, and that statute defines fishing, and it defines fishing to mean catching, taking, or harvesting of fish. The statute does not use the word aquaculture. For years, NOAA understood its authority to naturally sort of include aquaculture as a form of fishing. And back when I was an attorney with NOAA, our office actually issued the first permit to allow aquaculture, an experimental project in federal waters. That permit was challenged in court, and we worked with the DOJ to defend that permit. And in 2013, the Ninth Circuit applied Skidmore deference to agree with us and said, okay, yes, the harvesting of fish can reasonably include aquaculture. So that meant NOAA could actually put some restrictions on the activity. In the Fifth Circuit, however, a few years later, they took a different tack. This time, NOAA Fisheries, rather than doing a small permit, actually did try to pass a robust fishery management plan for aquaculture specifically. And analyzing the same statute, the Fifth Circuit disagreed with the Ninth, and the Fifth Circuit said, nope. Basically, because aquaculture is not in the statute and it was not included in the definition of fishing, they actually said the statute was a textual dead zone in terms of aquaculture. And what that meant was NOAA was not authorized to permit and regulate aquaculture as fishing. Now, administrative and environmental law lawyers and students in the audience are going to know that since Loper-Bright, there's definitely been a shift in how courts interpret statutory authority. Won't get too much into that today. But bottom line is that, the new Supreme Court jurisprudence, the new major questions doctrine, if anything, it is harder because of these doctrines, not easier, for NOAA to prove that it has the authority to issue regulations. And this is concerning to me because I think it would be NOAA that would be the appropriate agency to help bring in public comment and scientific expertise about what might be an appropriate aquaculture regime. One potential solution to this would be for Congress to amend the MSA to explicitly give NOAA that authority, but let me know if you want to hold your breath for Congress passing a new statute anytime soon. So that's actually where we are at in the federal side of things. It's a little uncertain, and yet the industry seems to be developing. The state side is different. Now, unlike the federal government, states do have what's called the general police power to regulate aquaculture within their state marine waters, on their land, on their inland freshwater streams. So what this means is at the state level, there's not so much a question of the state's authority to do something, but rather what are the states going to decide to do? And the states have been exercising their authority in a ton of ways, including, what species can be cultivated and where. Of course, it is quite a political hot topic. And I should mention that when we're talking about marine waters, for most states, that's the first 3 miles offshore. Now, I won't go into too much detail, but I've got a little chart here to give you a flavor of the diversity. Right? To my knowledge, all coastal states allow some form of marine aquaculture, but it might be only oysters and seaweed, right? Some actually prohibit fish. And I am here in Vermont, and so I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, of course, even landlocked states like Vermont have aquaculture, right? So there might be land-based hatcheries that build up freshwater fish stocks. There might be commercial shrimp operations, etc. So aquaculture actually impacts potentially all states. And at the state level, this really comes down to a policy choice. And some states like Washington, California, and Alaska have actually made the policy choice to just ban fin fish, marine aquaculture within their state waters. So it's not happening in coastal waters. However, it might be happening on land in those land-based regulatory tanks. Now, is that a better choice? Right? That becomes a choice for all of us to decide, essentially. It's gonna be a policy choice with some trade-offs. And so depending on whether you live in a state that allows or prohibits a certain type of aquaculture, just consider what that alternative source for that food is and what the environmental impact of that might be. And as I said, I am still sort of thinking through all of this myself in terms of where I come down. And I think much of that will depend on whether we are able to get regulators to encourage and enforce a more sort of ecologically sound approach to aquaculture. And again, it'll be very species specific and location specific. So I think what I'll do is I think I'll leave it there. I welcome your questions or comments. Mahalo and thank you. And I will stop sharing. There we go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that talk. I will remind the audience that's watching live, we have some time to discuss your questions. If you have them, please enter them in the chat space on the right-hand side of the page on YouTube, and we will get through as many as we can during our remaining time. But maybe I'll just sort of kick it off with a question about sort of the way that maybe law and policy are in a interesting moment in the aquaculture space, where I think there's a lot of interesting policy discussions going on around how aquaculture could be part of the mix, or the, you know, as you describe them, sort of some of the challenges of aquaculture, but where we have a lot of sort of legal legal delays in incorporating some of that policy discussion into actual regulatory frameworks. How do you think about, you know, the discussions about policy and about the merits and demerits of particular approaches and all the sort of all the factors involved in the shadow of what is a, you know, at least in federal waters, a very, very challenging legal, you know, sort of legal landscape?
It's a great question, and it's the hard question, right? So you started off with the good, difficult question. I love it. So I think a couple thoughts on that. One, I will say that some of this is mirrored in long-standing debates over terrestrial farming too, right? I mean, there's been policy and advocacy discussions about, you know, we should not be doing monocrop, like, you know, corn growing and things like that. And should we be using pesticides and herbicides? And this is sort of kind of just a long-standing policy and social choice that, you know, one of the critiques that folks sometimes raise about this concept of whether we can do sustainable aquaculture is they say, but it hasn't really been working on land, so why do we think we'll be able to get it to work in aquaculture? And I mean, it's a fair point. I think the reason why I'm cautiously optimistic is because aquaculture is, I mean, it's been around a long time, but some of the new technologies are actually quite new. They're in, especially in federal waters, they're in experimental stages. I do think we are in sort of a unique window where even if it's not clear what particular federal agencies can do or not do out in federal waters, which means generally beyond 3 miles of the coast, we're at a time where I think there's there can be a good use of advocacy and just general policy pushes to develop a certain kind of pen that is more marketable. I mean, there was a real negative impact to the industry when the Washington salmon farm salmon escapes occurred. Like that basically shut everything down there and for that particular region. And I think that the industry folks who are trying to build up aquaculture in federal waters, they don't want that, right? They don't want sort of the taint, the social stigma of sort of destroying the waters. And so I do think we are at a bit of a unique moment where it's possible to get in early from an advocacy perspective and from a consumer market perspective and say, we might be willing to do this, but not if it's, resulting in these huge catastrophic releases of the type we see in Norway. But I also think that it's kind of unavoidable. This isn't going to work without some form of regulation. And so it's unavoidable that we do need public pressure on Congress at the federal level and say, look, you are dropping your duty essentially to pass or amend some statutes to regulate what could become a massive industry just out in federal waters, and that Congress is the one that has jurisdiction over that. And I think you ask a good question, and unfortunately the answer is as hard as the question, which is you really do need Congress to do something about this.
One sort of dimension of this, which maybe was something that it has come out in some of your research on this topic. Developing sort of agricultural regimes, around different crops is actually very fraught in our climate change context, where temperature conditions, certainly in seawater, are changing quickly. The species that are suitable for particular areas over a decadal type of time horizon are changing rapidly. I think of the situation in the Gulf of Maine here, where lobsters are moving and no longer are really present in southern New England in the numbers that they used to be. And shellfish, some of the other parts of the fishing industry are changing rapidly. I wonder how that maybe plays out in the aquaculture space, where you might be developing a whole industry in a particular state, say Florida, where things are getting very warm very fast, and situation's going to change. The risks from those facilities may change. I don't know if you have thoughts on that angle.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think because of climate change and the changing conditions of the ocean and currents and everything that you mentioned, that is one reason why we might actually get pushed more towards aquaculture, because it's just becoming increasingly difficult to rely on wild stocks. But then if you're going to be doing the aquaculture in marine waters, you're kind of going to have the same problem. And that can happen to some of the large lakes as well, right? I mean, they're changing too. That potentially might be why there's so much interest in doing these land-based aquaculture facilities. They're, I think, just a little bit, at least in theory, they're easier to control the environment, the temperature, the salinity, the pH and everything of the water. So it may be that for the reasons you describe, it actually ends up being more of a land-based issue. But then we have, do we have space for this? Is this how we want to dedicate our precious land, to building essentially fish crops?
Well, our question in the chat goes right to this point. Do you think land-based RAS could be considered a beneficial alternative to some methods, species of offshore farming?
I definitely think there's great potential there, especially if they do that multi-trophic, the slide I showed where they have different species there, fish, kelp, oysters, because when you have those sort of enclosed pens on land, the water gets dirty fast, right? It's sort of kind of unavoidable. And that's and I think people kind of have a natural kind of reaction to it. And among all the other potential problems, some people are just sort of grossed out by it, frankly, and they don't like the idea of eating that fish, but it does not have to be that way. And I actually think there's been a lot of effort and research into creating essentially ponds that are mimicking the ecosystem. I also, though, think that we as consumers, or those of us who do consume fish, we have to come to grips with that might mean that some species of fish are just off the table. Like there are some species of fish that are heartier and survive more robustly in that type of scenario than others. And so having a sort of, sustainable, reliable source of fish food might be that you don't have necessarily the choice of your 20 favorite fish, right? It might be that 5 species of fish are actually more suited to this.
So I think I'll ask the one last question, which sort of builds off of that, which is, in the agriculture context, we think a lot about sort of the ways in which agriculture is a very favored industry within the political process, such that federal statutes get written requiring all sorts of important environmental protections, and then agriculture gets an exception. And the question I have in the aquaculture context is, how do advocates, policymakers, you were at NOAA, how do we think about avoiding that, managing that, working with that amount of political power, which develops very rapidly as soon as the revenues start flowing in to a particular industry, especially where, say, maybe some of the incentives are to provide a market for some of those species that, from an ecological or welfare or other perspective, maybe should be off the table or should be severely limited. How do you think about that as a policymaker and an advocate?
Mm-hmm. Well, the short answer from the NOAA's perspective is, I think because of the Fifth Circuit court case, it became so uncertain so early whether or not NOAA could do anything about it. I'm not sure the conversations, frankly, even got that far in terms of a more kind of, how will this impact economy and political issues globally? So I actually don't know that I could say we were having those conversations at NOAA, but just from a broader perspective from us as sort of concerned citizens and looking at it systemically, certainly not yet. I don't think the fish industry, well, one thing I didn't mention today really is, if we do enhance the aquaculture industry, there's probably going to be a lot of conflict with the wild catch industry, which already is, in some areas, is pretty well politically connected. So that's sort of a political layer to this that I didn't get into, but I think it's directly related to the question you're asking, which is, we do say sometimes, oh, well, if the wild caught industry declines, maybe they can transition into doing aquaculture. But the reality is that those are very different industries. They require very different startups. So I imagine that some of this is going to be worked out in sort of the political tug and pull between the wild catch and the aquaculture industry. Whether the aquaculture industry ever gets large enough here in this country to carry the same sort of political weight as, say, the cattle or ag industry, I'm actually not sure about that yet. I think it's a little bit of a wait and see situation on that question.
Well, I guess in closing, do you have observations for our students who are interested in this issue and how they might, think about structuring their next steps in their career, their path within law or graduate school, to really engage with this issue?
Oh, yes, I will love as many students focusing on this as possible, because I really do think it's sort of the next big question coming down. And again, as I said, because it's relatively new, I think there's a lot of space to really come up with good ideas and get in there right away. I think one of the important takeaways for students from today's talk is, regardless of where the science takes you and where the research takes you, that's all very important. At the end of the day, if there's not some sort of regulatory or policy structure around it, it's going to be hard to enforce any of that. And so for students that are passionate about these topics, I encourage you to learn about the science to understand what's possible, but then we are gonna have to grapple with sort of administrative law issues, Supreme Court cases about what is actually the extent of authority of these various agencies. And that'll be true down at the state level as well, right? What kind of regulatory structure does the state you live in have in place, and where is the wiggle room to either improve it. If it does become more of a land-based situation, we're talking zoning, right? Take land use. So you got to think a little broader about the types of law that are going to end up impacting how the aquaculture industry develops.
So I'll echo that, as with a lot of things right now, there are incredible opportunities at the state level. Sometimes it's a little bit less crowded at the state level in terms of folks focusing on a particular issue, and so dive in. So thank you very much. We're out of time for today's talk, so we'll wrap it up. Thanks again, Professor Turčan, for your presentation. And thanks to everyone who was watching us live, joining us today, and for those who are watching us later. Our next talk will take place online next Tuesday. So have a wonderful day, everyone.
Great. Thank you. Enjoyed it.